Ladies and gentlemen, the 14th of April 1912. The place, the North Atlantic, about 400 miles east-northeast of New York City. It was cold that night, bitterly cold and very still. There was no cloud, no wind, and a million stars shone down reflecting in the inky black surface of the sea. And upon the sea was a great ocean liner, motionless, her 8 accommodation decks ablaze with lights. Out around the surface of the ship, further out, you could hear the splash of oars being handled by inexperienced hands, the creak of the davits, the rasp of ropes through blocks as the boats were being lowered. Every 20 minutes, a rocket would rise high into the sky to burst above the ship and gradually fade into darkness. But the strangest sound that night, ladies and gentlemen, the most incongruous sound, was that of ragtime music coming from the deck of the ship. CQD, CQD, CQD. The message went out in Morse code. The spark gap transmitter was radiating along the copper wires strung between the masts, high up into the ionosphere, to be refracted and heard in the headphones of radio operators as close as Cape Race and as far away as New York City. CQD, CQD. Ship is sinking by the head. Come immediately, come immediately. She was conceived in the minds of men and born in the dockyards of Belfast, Harland and Wolff. And her labour was long. And the midwives, they were the hundreds of riveters, boilermakers, fitters, turners, carpenters who worked over her. But when she was launched, there's been nothing like her before or since. 882 feet long. That's as long as 4 downtown blocks in New York City. 92 feet wide. And when you stood at the wharf, it was like looking up at an 11-story tall building. Most ships had 1, 2 or 3 boilers. This ship had 29 boilers and 159 furnace openings. She was state of the art for the day. Nothing had been spared. In luxury, she had 15 watertight compartments, or so they said. And inside the ship, rosewood, teak, mahogany, oak panelling, crystal chandeliers. In the first-class cabins, they didn't have bunks like most ships. They had queen-size beds, marble lavatories, gold-plated taps, fireplaces. And the people who came aboard her were the cream of the American society. Colonel J.J. Astor and his young bride. Astor was worth $32 million back in 1912. What would that be worth today? There were the Guggenheims. There were the Wideners who owned Macy's stores. There were company presidents, railroad barons, oil tycoons, shipping magnates. They came aboard bringing their dozens and dozens of suitcases. And then there were the migrants. They came from the slums of Glasgow, Liverpool, London. They came from Turkey, they came from Greece. From all over the world they swarmed aboard that ship, some of them carrying their lifelong possessions in a cardboard box or a wooden crate. with a blast on her foghorn, the gulls shrieking around her tall masts, funnels wafting smoke. The tugs nudged her out into the grey waters of the English Channel, where she sailed across to Cherbourg, France. On reaching Cherbourg, late in the evening, one gentleman got off the ship. A few boarded, but he got off. He said, "I'm getting off this ship. There's something very funny happening. I've got this premonition that things aren't going to go right. Didn't you all see that when we left harbour, we actually drew that other ship towards us?" He said, "That's a bad sign. That's a sign of a collision. I'm getting off." And they said, "Ha, you're getting off this ship? 15 watertight compartments, the latest electrics. They can press a button and close all those doors in a few minutes. This ship is so safe, even God couldn't sink it." But he didn't believe them, and he got off. This vessel was so big that, of course, it couldn't get into Cherbourg. They actually ferried them out. It sailed then to Queenstown, where it picked up the Irish immigrants. Once again, too big to get alongside a wharf, they sailed them out in ferries. Can you imagine those people looking up at this great big monolith standing there like a city block, clambering aboard, full of excitement? The Titanic pulled away from Queenstown. On board her, 2,227 men, women and children. And they called this great ship the Titanic. Created in the mind of God and taking thousands of years to form, something else was shaping up. Over the eons of time, millions and millions of snowflakes had descended upon the glacier, compressing down into hard ice, more solid than concrete, as it moved slowly under its own weight down towards the coast, the west coast of Greenland. And then one day, boom, a mighty explosion as 3 million tonnes of ice broke off the end of the glacier and then just stood with water lapping around its base. The meltdown to oblivion had begun. Years went by, but at a certain time, when it reached about 500,000 tonnes, it began to float. It floated out, drawn by the current, the Labrador current, inexorably, right across the path where the great ship was to traverse. Meanwhile, on the ship, down in the stoke hold, men stripped to the waist, dripping sweat, the clank of the furnaces opening, the shovels going into the bunkers, the scrape and grind down below as they brought the boilers online. Up on deck, you've probably seen the film where they say, "Let's stretch our legs, Mr. Murdoch." Now, whether they did or not, who knows? But one thing, the top speed of the Titanic was supposed to be 22 knots. First day out, they're top 19. Second day out, they're over 20. Third day out, they were above their top speed at 23 knots. Were they going for the blue ribbon? People say no, but maybe they were. But on that ship, the passengers, of course, they had to be entertained. And they were being entertained by Lawrence Hartley and his 7-piece orchestra, playing ragtime music. Whilst in steerage, they'd smuggle their concertinas and their violins and fiddles on board, and they were bringing their home brew and dancing around and having a great time. But the crew of the ship, 900 crew, could you believe that? 900 crew. But very few sailors. They felt they didn't need sailors. This ship was like a floating hotel. They had footmen, waiters, chefs, assistant chefs, people who would clean your boots. These were the sort of people they had in the crew. Very few actual experienced sailors. Well, there were also 2 other men on that ship who didn't actually belong to the White Star Line. And they were Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. Jack was 25, Harold was 22. And these people were what they call Marconi men. What were they, do you think? Radio operators, right. And of course, nowadays, as you've seen it so often, you get a teenager standing here phoning his friend across the street on the corner with their mobile, right? Because it's a novelty. Even now it's a novelty. So in those days, back in 1912, radio was very new. The first transatlantic cord had been made in 1901. Few ships even had radio. But with all those people off to start a new life in a new land, they wanted to send telegrams and receive telegrams. And poor old Jack and Harold, using a Morse key to send and receive, they were really hard worked. They were working most of the time, 2 of them on together, but every now and again one would get his head down for a little while and the messages were coming in. Well, they knew on that vessel, the officers knew, that the ship was going to come up against a great big ice sheet sometime on the 4th night. Every winter in the North Atlantic, a great sheet of ice forms. This one had been reported as being 400 miles from the top to the bottom and about 300 miles across. They knew they were going to go into that. And they also knew that those ice sheets are sometimes interspersed with bigger blocks of ice known as icebergs. But they were pretty confident. Many other ships had just passed through. And so late that night, at about 9:30, a light flashed out of the darkness. And on the Titanic, they swung the signal lamp and replied, "Go ahead." And the signal came back in Morse code. "Titanic, this is SS Rappahannock, eastbound. Have just traversed large sheet of ice. Have sustained some rudder damage. Am able to proceed." And on the Titanic, they just said, "Thank you, Titanic. Thank you and good night." Not the least concerned. And on went the ship. At 10:30 that night, Jack Phillips took his headphones off, threw them down angrily because his eardrums were nearly burst as a ship very close by started to transmit. "Titanic, this is SS Californian. Keep out, says Jack Phillips. I'm busy working Cape Race. Keep out, I'm busy." But the operator on the Californian insisted, and he blasted out this message, an ice warning, and he said, "We are hove to, completely surrounded by ice." And Jack Phillips said, "Just rogered that." And the man on the Californian, he thought, well, it's getting on towards 11 o'clock. They're not taking any notice of me. I'm going to go to bed. Now, he was on watch by himself. There were no other radio operators on that ship. So he just hung his headphones on the back of a door, pulled out a canvas bunk and a blanket and lay down. And within about 20 minutes or so after that, the drama unfolded. The Californian was believed to be only about 10 to 12 miles away while this was happening. The watch changed, and onto the bridge came Mr. Murdoch, the first officer, Lieutenant Moody, and on the wheel a very experienced sailor called Able Seaman Hitchens. They just exchanged the details of the watch, look out for ice and this type of thing, but they were pretty confident because they had 6 lookouts on the ship, always 2 on, 4 off. And at that moment, a fellow called Lee, another fellow called Fleet, Freddie Fleet, were up in the crow's nest, freezing cold, 60 feet higher than the bridge, stamping their feet, trying to keep... And they're in this little cast iron box. You can imagine what it was like. And the wind, as the ship's going, which is about 40 kilometres an hour, you can imagine icy wind going by your face. Lee, of course, is crouched right out. He's saying, "You take it, Freddie, you have a look." Freddie Fleet's looking, and he's wondering, what happened to the binoculars? Oh, well, just have to look. So he's looking out. It was so clear that night. The sea was so smooth it was like a mirror. They reckon it's never been quite that calm since. It was just like a mirror. There were 1,000,000 stars shining above, and the stars seemed to come down, almost meet the water. But there was a slight haze on the horizon. Freddie Fleet's looking. Ship's coming, speeding along, a great wake going up for miles behind the ship. Big bow wave coming up. And he's looking and he's thinking, gee, we must be coming up towards that ice. I can smell it. I can smell it. And he's looking. Suddenly something started to happen which he found uncanny. In front of him, all those stars were suddenly being blacked out. He looked. There was mist. He looked again. He looked again. He rang the bell. Ding, 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 ding. Went to the telephone. Bridge, bridge. On the bridge they just strolled around. Yes, look out. Iceberg, sir. Iceberg. Dead ahead. Can you imagine what they did? Dead ahead. What will we do? Will we go left? Will we go right? A moment of hesitation and then, harbour starboard. Able Seaman Hitchens swung the wheel up, this way to port. Why? Because in those days, harbour starboard went starboard helm up. So he swung this way. And the ship should have turned to the left. But 46,000 tonnes, moving at 23 knots, doesn't turn like a mini-miner in a car park. It just kept going. Now they could see the iceberg right ahead of them. Now it was getting closer and closer. Would they make it? No, they were going to hit it. Full ahead, full astern, both engines, ding, ding. They rang down the telegraph. Can you imagine down below? The telegraph, which had been on full ahead for days, suddenly goes clang, clang, clang. The engineer looks at it. Full astern. So they stop the engines, and of course the ship keeps going. Now the iceberg's very close, but now the ship is turning very, very slowly to the left. Round it comes, round it comes. They're going to miss it. They're going to miss it. They see the iceberg flash by on the starboard side. A bit of it strikes a mast and some ice falls off onto the deck, but they're past. Even as they're breathing a sigh of relief, they feel just a shudder like that. A few tinkling of glasses on the table in first class, and they're past. And they just carry on talking. People go up on deck and look at the ice that's fallen down. Eventually, the ship, under its own momentum, comes to a halt. Engines stopped. Now, when those engines stopped, certain people woke up, because you get that vroom, vroom, vroom. There's the engines turning over, and that had gone. So Captain Edward J. Smith was the first on the bridge. "What's the problem, Mr. Murdoch?" "We've struck a berg, sir, and I'm ordering all watertight doors closed." And as he pressed the button, clang, 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 down below, the doors are descending. Down below, of course, later at the inquiry, a fellow called Jack Podesta was asked, "What actually happened? What did you hear when you hit the berg?" And he said, "Sir, it was just like someone was tearing a strip of calico." But it wasn't a strip of calico being torn. 500,000 tonnes scraping against 46,000 tonnes, inch-thick plates, brittle with cold. It put a series of punctures for 300 feet along the starboard side of the ship. Didn't rip it open like a tin opener, but just lots and lots of little puncture marks all the way along. 6 compartments. The water didn't just trickle in, it didn't pour in, it shot in almost as if it was under pressure from hoses all along the ship. Within a few minutes, the water was up around boiler room 6, up around their knees. They could see the doors coming down, dang, 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 dang. They jumped into the next boiler room, but even in there, the water was already inches deep. The stokers, of course, tried to make their way out at this stage. As I said, the ship was stationary. Captain Edward J. Smith was on the bridge. Captain Smith was a legend. He'd been at sea since he was 16. He'd been a captain at 25 years of age. He'd been with the White Star Line. And this was his last trip before they retired him. He was the Commodore of the line and a great personality. And they felt, well, if Captain Smith's in charge, everything's okay. Well, another man woke up on that ship, a fellow by the name of Thomas Andrews. Thomas Andrews was the managing director of Harland and Wolff. And Thomas Andrews had been the man who'd actually had a hand in designing the ship and overseeing it being built. And he knew all about it. And he thought he'd go down and have a look what was going on. Already Captain Smith had sent Lieutenant Boxall and the carpenter below to sound the ship. They'd come back and said it was all right. Andrews didn't believe it. He went down below himself. Straight away he saw that in the mail room was already flooded. They were pushing the mail bags up into the next level. So he went back to his cabin. He'd have been a first class cabin person with a big desk. He got out of the blueprints and he started doing some calculations. Now, I don't know whether he had a slide rule, I don't even know whether they were invented then, but he would have had some method of working out how fast the ship was sinking. He then made his way onto the bridge. Captain Smith, sir. Yes, what is it, Andrew? Captain Smith, this ship is doomed. What? What did you say, Andrew? This ship is doomed. It has about an hour, maybe 2 hours in which to live. Can you imagine how the captain felt? He knew that there were over 2,000 people on that ship, and he knew that they carried lifeboats for only approximately half of them. Why? Because some idiot in a boardroom had made a decision that they would never need all the lifeboats which were originally designed for the ship. It was originally designed to take lifeboats to carry 3,400 people, one boat within another. But they said, oh, we won't need those, take them off. They're cluttering up the boat deck. People like to stroll around up there. And so they had enough boats for half the people. Captain Edward J. Smith knew that. He knew they had to get help quickly. So he went along to the radio room, wrote out a message very quickly, said, Jack, get this away quick. Well, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were at the Morse keys. They looked and they thought the captain was joking. The captain had gone out. Hey, Jack, have a look at this. This is a CQD message. All right, well, he's the skipper, you better send it off. And so the message went out. CQD, 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 DE, this is MGY, the call sign of the Titanic. And then they sent the latitude and longitude of the ship. And then, come immediately, we need help. Well, being an old radio operator myself, and I know Max is down here, what would have happened, out of the loudspeakers and out of the headphones that have heard noises that went like this. As transmitters were being tuned up all over the place. And then the reply came immediately. Titanic, this is SS Frankfurt. We have your distress message. We are on the way. Request your position, Frankfurt. 150 nautical miles your position. 150 miles away, the first ship that answered. Another ship called the Carpathia was the second vessel to answer, 58 miles away. The nearest one to answer with a radio call. And yet there was the California, tied up just 12 miles, well, surrounded by ice, just 12 miles away. But it didn't know what was happening. On the California, after the radio operator had gone to sleep, the officer of the watch on duty had noticed that night a ship out on the horizon, brightly lit ship. They knew it was the Titanic. And as he was watching it, suddenly all the lights went out. And then they came on again. He couldn't believe it. He thought, that's funny. I must have blinked or something, because I'm sure those lights went out. That was the very moment that the ship passed by the iceberg. But he didn't know that. And of course, after a while, on watch later on, the first rocket went up. Rockets at sea mean distress. And then he thought to himself, nah, this is the Titanic. They got Bruce Ismay on board and all these VIPs. This is a sort of a picnic. They're sort of showing them what to do. This is an exercise. This is how he rationalised. 20 minutes, another rocket went up. And he thought, gee, maybe it's serious. All right, I better do something. So he called out to one of his seamen, Johnson, wake the steward. Tell the captain we're seeing rockets go up. Well, Mac would agree with me here. There are people in the Navy who you do not disturb. Certain naval officers, you cannot touch them. You cannot physically touch a ship's captain to shake him and wake him up, right? Now, on this vessel was Captain Lord. That was his name. And Captain Lord was a martinet, a disciplinarian. He was hated and feared by his crew, even his officers. And so they asked the steward to knock on his door to wake him up. So the steward went to the door. Captain, sir, Captain. No reply. Captain Lord, sir, Captain Lord. And he heard this voice say, what is it? And taking discretion in the better part of valour, he said, I'm not going to annoy the captain. He quietly went away. And that's as close as it got to ever being a rescue. Meanwhile, back on the Titanic, they're trying to get the people up on deck. Now, they didn't have a PA system. They had to get the leading steward to get his stewards to go along and knocks on the doors. They're knocking on the door. Excuse me, get some blankets, get some warm clothing, get up on deck, go away, you horrible man, and all this sort of stuff. And no one would come up. And eventually a few came up, and at that time, the Titanic was letting off this enormous amount of steam pressure to calm down the boilers, because the boilers had been going full blast, and now the ship was stopped. So all there was is a scream of steam. Terrible up there. So they all went down below again. In the meantime, Captain Edward J. Smith had now got probably a star fix or something like that, and he knew their position was slightly different from the original message. So he goes into Jack Phillips. Jack, I want you to get this amended position report away. All right, sir. And Harold Bride looks at him and says, look, we should be using the new procedure. What do you mean? What's the new procedure? Well, CQD's out now. It's this one. And this is how the message went out. SOS, SOS, SOS. And now people were listening in all over the place. There were amateur radio operators in New York listening on. There were 32 ships strung out between New York and London. But most of them didn't have radio. Just a few ships. There was believed to be an illegal sealing boat taking harp seals off the ice. But of course it wouldn't have had a radio, even if it was there. The nearest ship of any assistance was the Carpathia. And Captain Rostron on the Carpathia, 58 miles away when they took the message, he said, well, we better get over there. Now, their ship had a top speed of something like about 15 knots, right? But they closed down all the ancillary equipment, they tied down the safety valves, and the stokers got in there, built up the boiler, built up the steam, and she was doing 17 knots, far above her so-called top speed, to get to the Titanic on time. By now, of course, on the Titanic, people are up on deck, the noise has stopped. Come on, ladies and gentlemen, get in the boats, get in the boats. No one would get in the boats. By now, of course, the ship is lower in the water and it's got a slight list to starboard. They're trying to launch boats on the port side, on the starboard side, and one of the boats, their boats have actually swung out. And there's a gap of maybe 2 or 3 feet between the side of the boat and the boats. Doesn't seem much, but when you're looking down about 70 feet to water, and you know that if you slip, you're gone, it takes courage. No one would get in. Come on, ladies, in we get, first class passengers, ladies. Well, one woman, Lady Cosmo Duff Gordon, threw this stole around. Come on, Mary. And her and a maid stepped into the boat. They started to lower the boat as one sailor got in to steer it, one man up front, and then the rest of them, men jumped in. That boat pulled away from the side with 14 people on it. Boat number 1 should have taken 42 people. It pulled away with 14. By now, of course, other boats are being pushed out on the davits to be lowered. But as I said, they had very few experienced seamen. There were all sorts of muck-ups. Boats were coming down unevenly. Things were getting caught up in the davits. They were having to cut things away with seamen's knives. But gradually, as the boats came down and the ship got lower in the water, people started to think, well, gee, there's a lot of people on deck. There's not many boats. There's not many boats here at all. And that's the time the panic started. At that moment, the ship had been slowly going down by the head, but the whole ship was above the water at that time, and all of a sudden it went boom. Something happened. What it was is the vessel had broken its back. Its keel had snapped, and it was only the plates that were holding the two halves together. The front half went down and up and down again. The back half almost broke away, but held. A big wave swept along the deck. And now they knew how deep it was in the water. Now the panic started. Now that the officers had to get their guns out. Bang, 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 keep back, it's women and children first, keep back. But the last boat had pulled away and the ship was starting to sink now. And as it started to sink, they could see now from the boats around the ship, the propellers above the surface of the water. But every single light on that ship was alight. The people in the boiler rooms had done wonders to keep the generators going. They could see it rising slowly, more slowly. And at that time, something magical seemed to happen. Because from the poop deck, they suddenly heard, wafting across the water, the sound of ragtime music. As it rose a little bit more, they could see people were walking aft, trying to get away from it. And as it rose a little bit more, it was 20 degrees, 30 degrees, and now they're scrambling like little ants towards the after part of the ship. People are falling over, people are jumping. No more rockets. Suddenly it reached about an angle of 40 degrees, 50 degrees, 60 degrees, and then suddenly all the lights went out and they heard this terrific crashing and thundering as all the boilers broke loose of their fittings and crashed through the bulkheads towards the front of the ship. Up she came a little bit more, and all they could see in the lifeboats now was this black shadow against the stars of the background. Up it came more and more and more. It was nearly vertical. And it seemed to hold there for a moment, as if refusing to go, and then all of a sudden it slid into the deep. Bubbles had come came above the water, and they could hear in the lifeboats hundreds and hundreds of people, "Help me, help me, help me," coming across the water, the cries. But they daren't go back into that melee. Besides, most of them didn't know how to handle oars anyway. Gradually the sound died away, less and less and less, until eventually they heard the most dreadful sound of all. Total silence. It was cold that night, bitterly cold. There was no wind, no star, no cloud, and a million stars shone down upon the surface of the sea, reflecting in the inky blackness, to reveal a circle of lifeboats, and in the middle, nothing. It was as if the great Titanic had never been. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Ladies and gentlemen, master storyteller Tom Ware.
Thank you, Alan.
Storytelling at its grandest and most majestic. Fantastic, Tom.
Fantastic.